The first production batch of large diesels to enter service with British Rail were the D200s or Class 40. Initially, 10 were ordered as far back as 1955, D200 entering service in March 1958, based at Stratford, North London. They were powered by the same power unit used in the Southern Region prototype 10,203, this being the 16 SVT Mark II, rated at 2,000 brake horsepower at 850 RPM. In fact, there are a lot of design similarities between the two, bogies and engine compartment layouts to name a couple. At the same time as our own Class 40s were being constructed, a sister class were being built for Rhodesia. Looking like a cross between a Class 40 and the prototype Deltic, they were powered by the 12 CSVT and rated 2,025 brake horsepower and are still in use today. In all, 200 Class 40s were built, 20 at Robert Stephenson and Hawthorne, numbers D305 to 324, and the rest at Vulcan Foundry. Locomotive building at the Robert Stephenson and Hawthorne Darlington plant ended in 1964. The last Class 40 to be delivered was D399 in September 1962. Class 40s finished service on British Rail by the end of 1985. Here are some scenes of the class from the early 70s and 80s.
services are attended to. The train now standing at platform 3 is for the gambling and business.
This Class 40 was built at Vulcan Foundry by the English Electric Company. It was delivered new in March 1961 to Crewe Diesel Depot and was soon put to work on the West Coast Main Line. The Class 40s were the first large diesels to be used on the West Coast Main Line and monopolised Anglo-Scottish services out of Euston for many years. The Royal Scot, the Caledonian and the Midday Scot, to name a few. The completion of electrification south of Crewe by 1966 and the arrival of the more powerful Class 50s towards the end of 1967, so the reign of the 40s on the West Coast Line come to an end. They were subsequently transferred to other depots for more menial duties. In May 1974, D335 was renumbered 40135. Its final allocation prior to withdrawal in January 1985 was Longsight in Manchester. However, extra duties were in store in May of that year when she entered the departmental pool as 97406 to assist with the remodelling programme at Crewe. 40135 was finally put to rest in December 1986 after a career of 25 years and 9 months. The Class 40 Preservation Society took delivery of the locomotive in late 1988 and she worked her first passenger train in October 90. Her future is now guaranteed as one of the most popular attractions here on the East Lancashire Railway. Before starting the locomotive, it's necessary to connect the main battery isolating switch. I've just done that, and I'm now going to place this key into the master controller there to run the lube oil priming pump. The lube oil priming pump pumps oil through the engine before we start, thus preventing the possibility of the engine seizing up on starting. Controls on the Class 40 are fairly straightforward. The handle I just moved there is the main direction controller. That's forward and that's reverse. This one is the main power handle. You pull it back to get more power. And over here we've got the two brake handles. This one is the locomotive air brake and this one is the train brake. This being a dual brake locomotive will operate both air and vacuum systems. Down there is the dead man's, the pedal I'm now pressing with my foot. If I take my foot off that when we're on the road, the train will stop. I'm not going to press the start button to actually start the engine.
The restoration of Class 40 number 212 Oriole by the Class 40 appeal after the loco was parked at Carlisle for 2 years to provide spares for D200. Tastefully repainted in BR blue with pre-top's number, she departs Swanwick for Butterley on the 16th of October 1994. Another English electric class to enter preservation on an amazing scale is of course the Class 50. 50007 Sir Edward Elgar, still carrying the distinctive BR green livery, is aided by Class 47. Sheffield Midland Station was totally rebuilt in the early 1900s, and even in the 1970s and 1980s services were still worked by a variety of different loco classes. Rail Blue liveried 37168 moves on to the station, while Class 40 number 40084 heads north on a summer Saturday special. It's July 1983 and 4181 departs Manchester Victoria in a scene typical of the period. However, both the month and the locomotive were to be written large in the story of the final years of the Class 40s. The locomotive will come to later, but the significance of the month was the re-emergence of D200 in green after a celebrated repaint at Towton. Following a trial on a hitching to King's Cross parcels, the loco worked the Hadrian Pullman the following day on the 31st of July 1983.
Train now standing at platform 3 is the 1147 in the City 125 service to London.
Also during the summer of 1983, forties over the Settle and Carlisle were quite regular. Indeed, the additional passenger business during August was so great that the 1040 Carlisle to Leeds and return, rostered for Class 40 haulage, had to be strengthened by BR. But back at Manchester Piccadilly, the 1983 summer of fun was approaching the end when 40079 returned with the last Skegness working of the year. However, by now the class was often being requested for rail tours. The South Yorkshireman ran from Birmingham via Crewe and Wakefield for trips to Doncaster Works and Towton on Sunday, April the 1st, 1984. And on the 12th of May, the Centurion Double took 2 40s from Liverpool Lime Street to Edinburgh via Shap and the West Coast Main Line, returning via the East Coast Main Line as far as Doncaster. Here the tour departs Earlstown. By the summer of 1984, the 40s were back on the 1040 Carlisle to Leeds diagram. 40013, which seemed to attract a particular following towards the end, arrives at Saltaire on the 30th of June. But history was made 6 weeks later on September the 15th. During the summer of 1984, the most popular service train had been the 0815 Manchester Piccadilly to Skegness and return, rostered for 40 haulage. On the final day, the last working was hauled by 40181. The loco ran complete with a headboard, The End, for the 0815 outward journey, and also a headboard, Whistler's 1958 to 1984, for the 1324 return. But once again there were always the rail tours. The Pennine Summits tour on the 29th of September ran from Nuneaton over the Settle and Carlisle and back to Rugby. Power for the outward leg was provided by 40028 and 155, seen here climbing Copy Pit. But probably the most remarkable tour of all ran on the 9th of November 1985. On January the 20th, the decision had been suddenly made to withdraw all the Class 40s but 3, which were to be retained for enthusiast specials. One of these, D200, became the first of the class to reach Penzance, when Train Tours Charters ran the Penzance Friar from Manchester Victoria, departing at 0300 hours and reaching Penzance via Crewe, Birmingham and Bristol. The fare was £20.50 from pick-up points up to Crewe and £19.50 from Birmingham and Bristol. and the object was to raise funds for kitchen equipment for the Railway Children's Home at Derby, hence the tour named the Penzance Friar. And it's celebrations all round as the first Class 40 ever enters the terminus at Penzance. On withdrawal, this locomotive happily was preserved, as was the case with 6 other class members. 4145 arrived at the East Lancs as early as 1984. Its passenger debut as a lucky survivor took place in April 1987, but possibly the luckiest class member was D335, which not only once, but twice escaped the scrapman at the 11th hour. Firstly, on the Doncaster scrap line in 1985, it escaped the torch by 1 day, before reinstatement as a crew ballast departmental loco. And secondly, in 1987, when the loco was sent to Swindon for scrap and actually reached Gloucester before the decision was reversed. Here, in immaculate green livery, the loco arrives at Ramsbottom. Both of these locos were purchased by the Class 40 Preservation Society, one of the most active groups in the 1980s, and one to whom other enthusiasts owe a great deal for helping to keep the Class 40 story alive.
Class 40s, meanwhile, made diminishing appearances on the main line as withdrawal loomed. One obvious drawback with the Class 40s was that they could only supply steam heating. Selby was once a busy crossroads for freight traffic. This Class 40 is hauling a northbound Speedlink service consisting largely of railway-owned OBA wagons. An interlude between Deltic departures is filled by another soon-to-be withdrawn type, the English Electric Class 40. York Depot had had a longer association with the English Electric Class 40s. This particular example was allocated to York for many years, until transferred to Healy Mills in 1980. Classes. Also just a memory now is Class 40, number 40071, seen here leaving Scarborough in the late 1970s. About 10 miles north of York, at the halfway point between London and Edinburgh. This Class 40 is heading north with yet another rake of steel wagons. Smaller shunting yards scattered around Tyneside. Until the 1980s, the Royal Border Bridge remained more or less in its original state. Work on the East Coast Main Line electrification scheme hadn't yet begun. The erection of overhead masts here was to arouse a lot of controversy. At one stage, it was apparently even suggested that the bridge should be left without overhead catenary and trains left to coast over it. Fortunately, common sense prevailed. The local service between Newcastle and Edinburgh produced a small number of locomotive-hauled workings, often using Class 40 motive power. This example is working the 1718 departure from Edinburgh to Newcastle, formed as usual of Mark I stock. For heavier duties, Scotland received an allocation of about 20 Class 40s, divided between Haymarket and Eastfield depots. Among their regular duties were Edinburgh to Aberdeen expresses.
It was completed by the Midland Railway Company in 1876 after approximately 6 years' work and was immediately recognised as a triumph of Victorian skill and engineering. Here, Class 40 40099 has left the line at Steeton, east of Settle Junction, with the 1040 Carlisle to Leeds on the 10th of August 1984. Although the daytime London to Glasgow Thames-Clyde Express was diverted away from the route in May 1976, peaks could still regularly be seen on expresses between 1983, just 10 months before withdrawal. Just north of Burkett Tunnel lies the station. Next view, the loco is in charge of the 12 o'clock Scarborough to Manchester on the 13th of August 1983. The 1710 York to Manchester produced Class 45, number 40, and still in the Manchester area, Class 40, number 40029, moves on to Guide Bridge. Although, as we said earlier, the nameplates were removed from the Class 40s in the early 1970s, a decade later, many were stencilled back on the loco sides where the former names had been. The Class 76 DC electrics were introduced mainly in the early 1950s and were to be used on both passenger and freight. Arrives with Pullman stock bound for Scarborough on the 25th of June 1983. Class 47s have been hauling passenger services on British Rail for 30 years. 47079 was named George Jackson Churchwood shortly after its introduction as D1664 in March 1965. In March 1979, the nameplate was shortened to GJ Churchwood and we're Freightliners to Holyhead, and 4158 is the loco in charge on the 14th of May 1983. Alas, both Class 40s on BR and Freightliners to Holyhead are now no more than memories. And as the Whistler climbs the gradient out of the station, we enjoy our final view. Class 45, number 45057, also were frequent visitors to York. 4185 moves out from under the arches with a Scarborough to Glasgow summer Saturdays only service. Our final scene at York portrays another Deltic, 55018 Ballymoss, heading south for King's Cross. This loco was based at Finsbury Park Depot for 20 years, County Durham. This loco was withdrawn 5 months after this shot and cut at Doncaster a year later. A Rail Blue 37 next, 37246 Powers North. Both of these shots were filmed on the 12th of July 1983.
By this time the Class 40s had been relegated to secondary duties by their faster and more powerful sisters, which were found often double-heading on the top link duties until been demolished. Opposite is the new diesel depot. Class 40, number 242, passes some TPO and sleeping cars in the sidings. We'll move to Stevenage in the mid-1960s. The English Electric Type 4s were still found on many Class 1 turns. This example heads for... The lack of a yellow warning panel dates this picture to the late 50s or early 60s. It's followed... An Aberdeen train arrives at Montrose in the summer of 1961. The locomotive returns from the Granite City a few hours later. English Electric Type 4s have just taken over from the Britannia class steam locomotives on the Norwich Expresses. As a temporary measure until perspex sheets were fitted in the head code boxes, locomotives displayed all zeros, as in the case of the Class 40 on the Western Region main line between Didcot and Reading. This, of course, made the job of train identification rather more difficult for...
Of March 1958, the first member of a new locomotive class entered service on Britain's railways. The class was known as the English Electric Type 4, and 200 examples were built by 1962. The numerical sequence was D200 to D399, and all but 20 were built by English Electric at Vulcan Foundry, the remainder being constructed at Darlington. From 1973, the class was renumbered into the new top system, receiving the numbers 40001 to 40199, and thus the Class 40, as the series was always referred to thereafter, was born. The class had been first introduced in 3 distinct nose-end styles. 40082 with marker discs passes Chinley on a Manchester to Yarmouth service. Other examples were built with split box route indicators for the train reporting number, although these were later changed to twin spots, as noted here as 4141 departs Manchester Piccadilly. The third design was a central head code panel. 4152 arrives at New Mills with a Yarmouth to Manchester service. Although originally conceived for top-rank mainline duties, the Class 40s also handled freight workings. 4192 brings a mixed freight past Smithy Bridge. A Class 40 also had the dubious honour of hauling the last book freight train over the Settle and Carlisle in 1983. 40056 takes a Carlisle to Healy Mills freight over Ace Gill just before the end. And 2 months later, on the 9th of July, 4195 passes Chinley with the 0804 Manchester to Skegness. But the 1980s saw withdrawals commence on a large scale, and by the beginning of 1983 over half the class was gone. They were, however, still to be seen on both East and West Coast main lines, but no longer on the crack expresses of old. 40034 arrives at Warrington on the 7th of April 1983 with the 1545 Manchester to Bangor. And 40028 draws into York on the 18th of June with the 1925 Scarborough to Liverpool. A day later, 40099 was to be found on humbler duties, shunting ballast at Guide Bridge. The 40s were also frequently used on Freightliner services to and from Holyhead. 4158, one of the class originally allocated to Haymarket in Scotland, is noted with a service approaching Manchester Victoria. And inside Manchester Victoria Station itself, 40058 is employed on a Pullman duty to Scarborough on the 25th of June 1983. The 40s were often used on passenger workings to and from Scarborough, and on the same day 4124, the last of the batch built at Darlington, moves on to Scarborough Station. By now, the 40s were rapidly gaining the reputation of a celebrity class, and most of their movements were recorded by a growing band of faithful enthusiasts. 4124, nicknamed Beast, is undoubtedly the centre of attention here, as she prepares to take out the summer Saturday's only service from Scarborough to Glasgow, once again on the 25th of June 1983. And after arrival at York, 4124 is exchanged for 4185, which will continue the journey to Scotland. And 4124 returns to the Midlands, with 1M74, the York to Manchester Victoria, noted here removing the stock to Redback carriage sidings. During the first half of 1983, a further 21 class members had been withdrawn, but Peter Atkinson, who along with his son Jake filmed most of these sequences, persisted in rooting out the remaining working examples. On the 18th of July, 40069 was noted at Leeds, heading west for Clitheroe Cement. And on the same day, 4197 was seen at Dewsbury, giving a helping hand to Ailing Peak 45023, the Royal Pioneer Corps, on the 1324 Llandudno to Scarborough. In the 1970s, 4106 had become a celebrity locomotive, since it was the only remaining green Class 40, after 4136 had been painted blue. Most surprisingly, it was also repainted green at its classified repair in 1978, and thus retained the green colour scheme throughout the whole of its working life. The loco was withdrawn in 1983, but happily was purchased by Mr. Gerald Bowden the following year. It was moved to the Stone Yard at Loughborough Station on April the 16th, 1984, and to the Great Central Railway by road 2 days later. But 1984 also saw withdrawals continuing apace, and sights such as this became more and more common. 4192 draws 4 of her sisters to Doncaster for cutting on the 30th of July 1984. Unhappily, she was to suffer the same fate herself a few months later. A seen passing Diggle on the 21st of July 1984. By 1988, the peaks were running on borrowed tyres and 76ers. "40079 takes a short freight through the station and a sister class member runs by light engine. The Class 70 would be completed 4 years later in 1974. In the 1960s, steam, diesel and electric traction could all be seen at various locations on the route, and on some occasions, steam and diesels were even paired together. The route has always seen intensive passenger and freight action. At Hill Morton, the variety of traffic is illustrated with a blue AC electric. Class 40 number 389 runs by light engine. And Brush Class 47 number 1927 also.
The English Electric Type 4, introduced 1959, today classified Class 40. The English Electric Type 4, today classified Class 40, British Railways' first class of heavy-duty diesel-electric locomotive. Power output, 2,000 horsepower. Total number introduced, 200, constructed in a total of 6 production batches. They first saw service in any numbers on the East Coast main line. Later, they worked over much of the railway network, being most in evidence on the Midlands, Scottish and Eastern regions. A heavy-duty machine, both powerful and durable, It's proved an ideal freight locomotive. If there is a handicap, it's perhaps the poor power-to-weight ratio, a factor which is less of a drawback on trains like this ballast working approaching Carlisle in July 1984. It is the Settle and Carlisle Railway itself that has proved to be their most popular stamping ground in recent years. By the late 1970s, they'd been relegated to freight workings, excursions and parcels trains. "25 years ago, the picture was different. As replacements for Pacific steam power on the west and east coast main lines, they worked many crack expresses, including the Flying Scotsman and the Master Cutler. The successful introduction of the first members of the class in the form of 10 pilot engines can probably be traced to their pedigree. They were a development of previous pioneer mainline designs. In particular, Bulleid's diesel-electric design for the Southern Railway. Their number series was originally D200 to D209 pilot scheme engines, D210 to D299, and D300 to D399 production series. They were later classified and renumbered Class 40. For the past 25 years, they've constituted an important part of British Rail's diesel traction fleet. For a while, the Class 40s were the most powerful locomotives in service. This Class 40, seen from Little Steeping Box, is rare enough. But the host of signal boxes, signals and level crossings it will encounter on its round trip to Skegness make this a remarkable railway.
One of the highlights was Tyseley's D335, seen accelerating away from Northwood towards Bewdley. She had first appeared in public the previous weekend at Tyseley's Open Day, but, like the 27, was restricted to open days and galas. The 40 and the 27 were both on show at Snow Hill for the Midline Gala in the spring. They were hauled from Tyseley by the newly named 31413 Severn Valley Railway, which cemented the close cooperation between the SVR and BR at its naming ceremony the previous day. The unique livery has led the 31 being known as Ice Cream Van 2, after Tamworth Castle, the Class 25 retained by BR for training purposes. She lived a full service life for more than 3 years after her sisters had all gone, and was a favourite for inspection saloon work, as seen here. We surmised that she was taking an inspection team to visit Leyland at Workington to see Class 155 production. Her last rail tour bookings caused a certain amount of controversy and disappointment. After failing to appear on the southern region due to a staff dispute, she ran on the Midland in grey undercoat. This was the infamous Pennine 40 tour, passing Castleton PW sidings already over an hour late. She failed after Leeds, and it was at first thought that she would not complete her farewell programme. Happily, she was returned to traffic by Stratford MPD in pristine condition, sporting small yellow warning panels and no tops number, ready for her controversial handover to the NRM. We see her returning from Blaenau-Festiniog on the Tubular Bell tour, crossing a DMU at Llanrwst. A full D200 feature is in Rail Scene 15.